I want to recap a couple of things that I touched upon a few days ago, because I think I want to make sure that there's one thing that's not lost in translation. As an industry, areas in financial services, right? Whether it was operations, trading, market making, sales, now strategy and governance, and more specifically, as the business liaison, or one of the business liaisons between the frontline teams covering clients and structuring products, and our tech teams coming up with the design and architecture of systems and applications that we need to support that frontline. And I would like to say that we have come a tremendous way over time, obviously, but especially in the last handful of years as a consequence of the pandemic, where we woke up one morning and realized that we thought we had planned for things, and it turns out we just planned for the wrong things. Right? We had spent a lifetime thinking of crisis management as a situational reality, meaning we had spent enormous amounts of time, energy, and money building alternate sites, physical alternate sites, which we call dark centers, right? In the sense that physical footprints within reasonable reach from where our hubs are, which, for lack of a better term, we created a twin of our physical presence in downtown Manhattan, or midtown Manhattan, or the Loop in Chicago, or downtown Toronto, and we thought that that would be adequate. We were convinced of it. So much so, we spent millions of dollars. We would carry enormous footprint that goes unused most of the time. We'd send people over there 2 or 3 times a year to test it for one day at a time. And it's like, yeah, it works, we're good, let's move on. So, obviously that lesson was a hard one to take or go through, but we did, and we have indeed come a long way. As I sat in the various rooms over the last 3 days, it struck me how much we, and I can talk about myself primarily, didn't appreciate the amount of change and the complexity of the change that you all are tackling that is applicable to almost every part of my business. Identity, trust, cloud, edge of the network, redundancies, security, layering things over others in real time, as opposed to how we as a business operate most often, which is it's in a serial fashion, sequential. I do my part, I hand it off to somebody else, they do their part, they hand it off to somebody else, and so on and so forth, which, again, that is an area where we've gotten a lot better over the last few years, but we're nowhere close to where we need to be. As I was talking to Royal, and again, thank you for having me, we've realized very quickly that we perform better when we put more people on the field simultaneously. So our very rudimentary version of layering, right? Get the compliance folks, which we had crazy discussions about around the ethics and the regulation and the requirements associated with those. Get the technology folks in the room, have them educated and prepared before they actually are engaged. Figure out a way to get the information people need, regardless of what that information is, without breaching the information barriers that, as a business, the regulators impose on us, right? And so on and so forth. And doing so in a way that speeds up the processes more so than we've ever considered, right? So I can tell you that a lot of the problems that we suffer from the most today is not that we don't want or have a vision of implementing a metaverse, whether it's an internal corporate version of it or whether it's a grandiose metaverse that brings in our outside vendors and our customers and we all interact in one place. That for us is a phenomenal idea, but we still struggle with things that we consider to be table stakes, right? At the end of the day, I still can't tell you how many people I have on my network at any given moment. I can't tell you how well my network is operating. I can't tell you where the people are. I can't tell you whether the people that I need to involve in any given transaction or scenario have the tools and/or applications needed to actually perform that function that I'm going to ask them to do in the next however many days, weeks, or what have you. I can't tell you with confidence where people are storing all of my data. It could be across an enormous footprint of servers, on-prem, in the cloud, a hybrid version of it, and their emails. So it is a seemingly massive mountain of things that, from what I hear from what I've heard from you guys, you're all tackling and/or in some cases have solved for that we have not yet implemented. And it's not for a lack of a want to implement them, but sometimes we just don't know what's available, right? Because everything that we know about what is useful or could be useful to us gets funneled through one or two people in the form of a CIO or in the form of a CTO. And that's not to say that they're not competent, because as Royal as you know, Kim is a phenomenally competent woman and she's brilliant at what she does, but she's one person. And she might not know all the things that we are struggling with in real time. One of the things that I find alarming is that I still don't have a way of instantaneously giving you access to what I already know you're going to need. As a matter of fact, I don't have a real-time way of understanding what it is that you already have and what you don't have. In a perfect setting for us, we imagine a scenario where we are working on structuring a deal, origination of a deal, for instance, and when I invite you into the room, the system's automatically going to know what new applications and what new data sets it has to push to you or have readily available for you, without me having to request access from a Wintel team to grant you access to a folder that you never had access to, and I have a 72-hour SLA. What is that, right? And not only that, I send in a request and I don't even know where that request is going. It could be a team in Manitoba or in Saskatchewan, or it could be a team in New York City. I have no idea. And I have no way of injecting urgency into that request because I don't know those things. Like, even if I wanted to, I couldn't pick up the phone and call someone, because it could be a multitude of people that are actually helping us as best they can. So it's things that might sound rudimentary to some of you, but things that we struggle with very much so every day, right? And that's before we even get to the complexities of what we're trying to do on behalf of the client, right? You know, in the case of identity and trust, which has been discussed a lot over the last few days here, and I've found fascinating, you know, most of the time, for instance, when I'm thinking of assembling a deal team, I am doing so based on what I know, or more importantly, what I think I know, right? Who are the right people? Which goes to the conversation that we've had around credentialing, right? Normally, I know the right people based on whether I've worked with them, whether someone I trust has worked with them, or whether they've been around for long enough to have seen a situation like the one we're trying to attack on any given day. Do I have complete confidence in my ability to pick those people correctly? No. And I am not a gamer myself, per se, but there's certain things around gaming that I've always found very efficient, which is earning tokens, for instance, right? I know you're good in a game based on how many tokens you've earned. The closest thing I have to that today is a resume. Right, is that very efficient? No. I mentioned earlier this week as well that some of the best teammates that I've found over the years have been by happenstance. Bumping into them in certain situations and realizing that they had capabilities and skills way beyond anything we were asking them to do. Happenstance. That shouldn't be a thing, right? That should be something that as people are working and gaining knowledge and developing relationships within the organization, we should be quantifying and qualifying in a way that is useful to all of us, which is hard. But I believe things in gaming can afford us that.
I can give you a perspective of how I've done what sounds like a solution-y type thing in a previous game that I've worked on. So the game I worked on was called RuneScape. It's an MMO. It has 1 million people log in every day. And everything's tracked. So every piece of, even moving the mouse, every mouse movement's tracked when you access the game. You can see what's on people's computers. You can see the sort of computers they've got. You can see how everything's put together, the device they're accessing the game with. You can then use the data you've got to find people who are very good at certain things. So, for example, somebody who's good at killing other players, which you probably don't want in your industry, but you know, who knows? Somebody who's very good at killing other players, you can pull the metrics from it, and you can find out the people who have the best kill death ratios.
Sure.
You can find the people who can kill other people faster, because everything's tracked down to the individual in-game back-end server tick, and every piece of data is tracked. And it was throwing out, I think, 3 terabytes a day of data that has to get stored. The problem then comes is how do you use that data, because you can't just look at 3 terabytes of data and go, oh, that's what I want. So that's when you have your teams in place to actually interrogate that data when you need it, and you contact the team. I need to know this stuff. They'll figure out what it actually means, what you're actually asking for, and then send reports back on all this stuff. And that's all technology that's been around for 10 years.
Sure.
That we've been doing that for, and that sounds like
where
you want to get to.
And I think that you're hitting on a critical point here. That technology has been around for 10 years. How is it that we don't have it deployed? I'm not talking about killing people on the field, although you ask a few traders and they might welcome it. But that's exactly the issue, right? It's whether it's an issue of education or awareness, or it's just we're just thick-headed and don't want to slow down or focus our attention on things that we could scale up that would help us in the long run or not. I'm not sure why, but therein lies the problem. I mean, you're solving really, really hard problems, existential questions that I think we can all play a part in, right? I think it was, and I forget which presentation it was earlier this week where they were talking about porting digital assets between locations and a concern around the valuation of those assets. I'm like, well, I understand that concern. We had that problem 25 years ago. We figured it out in a physical manner. Now, I think there's a lot of lessons learned in that experience that we had from moving from a central exchange to an ARCA, to all the multiple market or liquidity pools that we currently work in that you can all derive value from based on the experiences that we had. We're no longer concerned around mispricing of assets across multiple investment pools or vehicles, because the second we do, we will know and we will arb it out immediately, right? We're watching multiple, assets, or so the same asset trading in multiple different venues at different prices, and it's never more than a fractional of a cent. It's no longer that crazy gap of multiple dollars, right? We will arb that immediately. But it's a question of figuring out a way in a collaborative manner that we can actually see where that mispricing is happening. In the case of ethics and regulation, maybe more so in our business than others, where people are and what they're doing matters. And it matters not just from an efficiency and operating efficiency perspective, but from a regulatory reporting, from a tax perspective, and from a legal perspective. It matters, and it's something that we've grappled with, especially during the pandemic, where we had thousands of people just move. And in many cases, we didn't know where they were, right? And they're performing work, very valuable work that has, as a consequence of it, a tax consequence, a legal consequence, a regulatory requirement. And the way we've traditionally done that is by literally looking at each other saying, do you have the right licenses? Do you have the right license? Are we in the right jurisdiction to be, working under the auspices of those licenses or not? One thing that we constantly struggle with, for instance, and I think Royal and I were joking about it a few days ago, was we have a global footprint of expertise, and it's centered around industries. Our metals and mining folk, our tech folk, our financial services folk. And we made it a global footprint because our clients are actually located everywhere. But it also afforded us an economy of scale where we could actually build centers of excellence in those industries based on the availability of talent, the cost of said talent, the diversity of that business within that sphere, which allowed for concentration. But what we didn't account for at the time was, well, if one of those people wants to move from Toronto down to New York to talk to a client, are they registered with FINRA? Because if they're not, and they're providing investment advice or structuring advice, guess what? They're not allowed to do so. So what has to happen? We have to chaperone that one person. One of us in the US who is licensed and has the right credentialing with the regulators now has to sit in a meeting that I maybe didn't have anything to do with, but only because I am acting as the legal and regulatory representative of this one individual who's a colleague of mine who doesn't have the right credentialing to actually be doing or delivering that advice or that opinion to a US domiciled client. And I say US domiciled, but the reality is that it changes by state and by territory, right? So what I'm allowed to do in New York is different than what I'm allowed to do in Tennessee. It's different than what I'm allowed to do in Texas. And for that, we have to employ an army of people that stay on top of what regulatory changes are happening, that are synthesizing and distilling those changes for us, and then delivering it in a way that we can actually consume.
How do you see that, though? You kind of bring up a point there about what you can do in New York and what you can do in Tennessee, but what do you do then when we have this kind of ecosystem like a metaverse that's global and knows no boundaries?
Mm-hmm.
Your New York to Tennessee is no different than you being from New York or Japan.
Correct.
Or from anywhere.
Yeah.
And those boundaries are there.
Yeah.
So is there a lot of thought between that, or do you see something where there are some standards or some communication, like the early points of it?
Yeah, no, so it's a great question, and the way that we tackle that today is we have hot cards, right? You're going to a meeting with a client in place A, you're going to look for that quick reference card. You can very quickly distill what is it I'm allowed to do, what is it I'm not allowed to do. And again, and this is not, none of us approach this with a malicious intent. We're actually trying to stay above board, but the nuances is such that it requires an army of people to stay on top of it and give it to us in a way that is timely.
Is that going to scale?
I'm sorry?
Is that going to scale? The magnitude of people that'll suddenly be available.
No, we're bumping up against the limitations of what we can do, right?
Forgive my ignorance, but presumably there are rules about, like, if I'm sitting in a room somewhere and you're sitting in a room somewhere else and we're talking over Zoom, there are like jurisdictional rules about, what localities rules have to be followed, right?
Yes. And sometimes there's multiple locality rules that we have to follow, and they might not be properly aligned.
And would this extend to the metaverse in a graceful way, or is it just completely out of the question that this would be extensible?
It's a great question, and that's why I'm here. All right. I think that between us all, we can come up with some really creative solutions that allow us the right node that we can dial up and dial down based on the circumstances, right? Because otherwise, I fear that we're going to continue to, or we're going to perpetuate what we are notorious for, which is modeling for the worst case scenario every single time, right? So I think of the pandemic, and I joked when I was presenting the other day that, I assume people had computers in their houses. I assume they had broadband in their house. Guess what? They didn't all have them. And there was people that for an extended period of time conducted really complex work off of their iPhones or their Samsung phones because that's what they had, because they lived 4 blocks from the office and had never not been able to go to the office, right? But I think my vision of a metaverse for us would allow us to accomplish things like that, right? So to have our compliance and legal teams educated, as I said, in real time around what we're doing and or about to do, to feed us with what we need to know before we start, right? We all know where we're going to be and what meetings we have tomorrow and next week most of the time. If we were to be able to provide all of those sorts of data points to the relevant parties in real time, then we could be much better prepared and scale without having to always be reactionary. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question for you. That some people seem to figure out how to implement, a lot of the sort of pain point or solving a lot of pain points you're referring to in financial services. I'm thinking about like maybe Ant Financial and those guys. And they do it by, I guess, trying to bypass the regulations. And then they run into problems, so they are in trouble today. And then there are other group of people trying to say, well, I want to create something brand new so that I don't fall into that regulation space. Sure. And they're also trying to do that to certain degree successfully as well. And then there's a third one, which I thought is very interesting. Basically, they will be following, sort of a combination of the two, will be following the rules to the letter, but all those rule following will be purely in automated.
Sure.
So you design a few points so that only those things need to go follow that, and I just carve that off, and I define a few interfaces, and all transactions happen there, and I'm strictly following the rule, but it's really the whole real thing doesn't happen there anymore.
Sure. No, you're absolutely
I don't know.
right.
So you're probably familiar with all these examples. Do you have an opinion on what is a better approach?
Well, my first opinion would be don't ever try to skirt the regulatory requirements. It doesn't work out well, period. But while on the topic of regulatory requirements, coming from a highly regulated environment, and more so than some people even appreciate, and I'll use the example, for instance, of client communication. So some of you might have been seeing headlines over the last few months around some massive fines being doled out to banks across Wall Street, some of them as large as $200 million a pop. And the core rationale behind those fines was communication with clients outside of permissible vehicles, i.e., you were talking to your clients on an unregulated device. Everything we write, everything we say, well, that's not true for all desks, but in many instances, every communication that we have with a client needs to be captured. And it needs to be stored and analyzed to ensure regulatory compliance. And there's a reason for that. There's a long history on Wall Street of things that didn't go well. And we are governed by a series of rules. I think the largest ones being the Securities Act of 33 and 34, for instance, that govern a lot of what we have to do today. It turns out that people started having conversations and/or communicating with clients via WhatsApp. And not because they wanted to skirt the rules, but because that's how their clients wanted to be communicated with. Our systems just weren't prepared to migrate from our traditional vehicles of communication to new ones. And based on how many banks have been caught doing the same thing, and again, not for malicious intent, it was just that's how your clients wanted to communicate, and bankers and the people who covered those relationships just naturally migrated to those vehicles. Some of them actually didn't know that they couldn't because they assumed that if the application is on the device I was given, then it must be okay, right? Again, another area of efficiency, right? Like what applications do you have? Are they the right ones? Do we know how you're using them, when you're using them, who you're using them with, et cetera, things that we can't do very easily today. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. For the last 15, 20 minutes, I see your struggle in, of having a balance between being innovative at the same time still adhering to regulatory and all the, and then being conservative. Right? So I'm just wondering, you were at the Digital Twins talk too, I was there too. So do you guys do like A/B testing whenever you have a new initiative or new program? Do you think that having a digital twin of your current environment to help you roll out a new program or initiative, would that help?
Absolutely. I mean, the reason I was at that talk was because I've always thought of the possibility of a digital twin as being an ideal tool for us, or for myself as a business manager, to see how my systems, my processes are truly performing. Right now, we depend on, simple, I say simple, but they took a while to develop, but simple dashboards where it's red light, yellow light, green light, is this working or not? But the reality is there's enormous limitations to those dashboards, right? They're working based on, was the task complete? Yes, no. If yes, green, right? If no, past a certain point, yellow. If not at all, red, right? I don't have the ability to simulate anything with that per se, without physically doing the simulation, meaning taking a key man or key woman out and seeing what happened, right? One of the amazing things that we do is for people that work in critical lines of business, every year we take them offline for 2 weeks just to see how things change. Well, what if those 2 weeks is not when that individual wants to take their vacation? What if those 2 weeks happen to be in the middle of some situation where I absolutely need their expertise on the line and I can't afford to pull them out? Plus, it's an inefficient thing to do. It's like I should be able to simulate all these scenarios and run them through a digital twin, I would hope, or a series of connected digital twins that roll up into something like what Melanie from Accenture was talking about, managing by control room or control tower, right? It's a series of digital twins across all my processes that roll up into a true real-time health status of my organization. Now, from where I stand today, that is almost like pie in the sky type thing, right? I'm like, are you kidding me? I can't even tell you who's on the network. But you're right, it is a struggle. It is a struggle because we want to innovate and we want to get to the next gen, but we can't do it without knocking something else offline. We don't have unlimited resources and or expertise to actually think about what we could be doing that's better. And that's not to say that we don't have people that are completely dedicated to that conversation, right? We have engineering and technology teams that are unbelievable at what they do, but they're also responsible for helping us keep the lights on. And we are a business that, despite some of our incredible technological advances, think low latency trading, think computing and algorithmic trading. We have silos where there's enormous amount of innovation and cutting edge technology being deployed, but it stops there. You don't see it propagate through the organizations as often or as much as you should. Yes, sir.
So it's kind of interesting because you see a lot of these metaverse talks, right? And in these talks, people from your vertical are simply just not there. So how do you think after spending a few days here, that people from your industry would be more interested in what's going on here, because if we're developing standards and processes on how this metaverse will work,
Sure.
it sounds like even changing 0.5% of what the standards are that can accommodate for some of the things that you need.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a conversation that your industry is interested in having?
Absolutely. I mean, I've enjoyed the last few days tremendously, and I've never been invited to one of these conferences. Right? It happened by happenstance, as a matter of fact, right? Kim couldn't make it, and you got the B team, like I said on the call the other day. But, you know, and that's not to say, that's not passing judgment on Kim or our tech teams. It's just, we don't even know what you're working on. Like, we're consumers of what you're, like, we're gamers. For us, it just turn it on and it works. And it's like, this is fantastic. Right? And I'm like, well, how did that actually happen? Right? The conversations around identity and trust certificates. And I use the example of interchangeability of assets between the physical and the digital, and how I experienced it for once in my life in the early 2000s in the floor of the New York Mercantile Exchange, where we had a group of people trading large physical contracts on the floor and a bunch of bandits upstairs trading mini contracts, until someone somewhere, and I don't even know who that individual is, decided that they should be interchangeable.
And do you think it's the right time?
Absolutely. I absolutely. I think it is. I think that we're getting better at it. I think it's about bringing more diverse set of individuals into the conversations, because otherwise we run the risk of watching the train leave the station and then always playing catch up, and or even worse, being beholden to solutions that aren't fit for purpose.
Because you brought up a point that the reason they're getting in trouble is because your clients are pulling them.
Some of them are moving at breakneck speed. I mean, when you're looking at what the Apollos of the world, or the Blackstones and BlackRocks of the world are doing, what the Fidelities of the world are doing, they're looking at us saying, where are you? Like, why is it that I can do this and you're not doing it? Well, guess what? Because you're only doing it for yourself, and I'm doing it for 4,000 people. Or 4,000 clients, all of which have thousands of clients each, and they're not where you are. Right? And again, that's not to say that we are, we're just not prepared. We're not moving fast enough, I think. And we want to, but we need your help. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.